appears that we have a quorum, so we have a few more people that are going to trickle in, but I think we can get it kicked off since we have a crowd here today. We're not broadcasting live, but we are recording this, and so when your mic is on, it will be recorded. It's hot all around. Okay. Yeah, so no wine until after the event. Yeah. Okay, got it. So good morning and welcome to the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. It is 10:05 on Monday, October 28th, 2024. We're here at Bogle Vineyards, just outside of Clarksburg, California. My name is Julie Lee, and I am chair of the Delta Stewardship Council and presiding over this DPIIC meeting. Before we dive into today's topics, I'm going to ask Eric to explain how the public can participate in this meeting. Eric?
Any member of the public is interested in providing If any member of the public is interested in providing public comment on the agenda item during today's meeting, please submit a blue card to me. Blue cards are available on the materials table and here. Be sure to note a name and the agenda item that you wish to speak on. When called, please stand up, state your name and affiliation, and begin your comment. We ask that you keep comments relevant to the agenda item and advise 3 minutes or less.
Eric, I'm not sure your mic is working.
It is for online.
Oh, for online. Okay. Okay, so just for members of the people that are here in person. Got it. All right, couple more housekeeping items. The restrooms are to the left of us outside in the parking lot. We've checked them out. They're swanky, so go enjoy those. And as I mentioned, we're recording the meeting, and the microphones will pick up everything. So Eric, now in accordance with our Bagley-Keene requirements, can we do a roll call?
California Department of Food and Agriculture, Christine Birdsong. California Department of Water Resources, Cindy Messer.
Here.
California Environmental Protection Agency, Katie Lando.
Here.
California Natural Resources Agency, Samantha Arthur.
Present.
Central Valley Flood Protection Board, Jane Dolan.
I'm here.
Delta Protection Commission, Diane Burgess.
Here.
Delta Stewardship Council, Julie Lee.
Here.
National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, Amanda Cranford. Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy, Campbell Ingram.
Here.
San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, Corey Copeland.
Here.
State Water Resources Board, Jay Ziegler. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Josephine Act.
Here.
U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, Todd Twain.
Present.
U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Sonia Chilling-Arian. U.S. Geological Survey, Jake Welcome.
Yes.
All right, thank you. We have a quorum. We have one more piece of business this morning. Does anyone have any edits to the April 2024 DPIIC meeting summary? Nope. If not, those will stand as they were provided to you. With that business out of the way, we're going to get going. This is my first time presiding at a DPIIC meeting. I'm really excited to be here and look forward to speaking with all of you throughout the day. Before we begin our focus on levees, I have a few updates to share with you all on topics previously discussed at DPIIC, and when I'm done, I'll invite others to share as well. First, regarding the items from the last gathering, the HABS strategy that DPIIC endorsed in concept is now final and posted on the council's webpage. Additionally, a group for implementing the strategy is forming under an interagency ecological program project work team. And second, the Council's Tribal and Environmental Justice issue paper has been put out for public comment. So we look forward to comments from your agencies, and the public comment period ends on November 4th. I'm also excited to announce the release of the fiscal year 2022-23 Delta Crosscut Budget Report. It's the 5th annual report and is a testament to the benefits of collaboration in the Delta. This report helps us better understand how and what we're funding in the Delta when it comes to scientific research and restoration. And I want to thank the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and Council staff for their continued leadership on this report. You all have a printed copy in front of you, and there are more on the meeting materials table. And finally, on November 13th, in collaboration with the Delta Conservancy and Restore the Delta, the DPIIC Restoration Subcommittee will host their fall meeting, which will be an in-person field tour open to the public. This tour will focus on restoration opportunities in the South Delta, which has seen the slowest rate of restoration progress in the Delta. The group will visit areas where restoration is currently being planned and scoped, with an emphasis on multi-benefit restoration opportunities in Stockton. You can contact Amanda for more information about that. I also understand we have quite a few legislative staff with us today to learn about the Delta's levees, so I want to thank you for joining us, and please feel free to ask questions throughout the day during the tour or any of our panels. And always please reach out to our legislative and policy advisor, Brandon Chapin, if we can ever be of assistance to your offices. There's Brandon, smile and wave. Does anyone else have any updates that they would like to share? Morning, Jay. All righty. Eric, are there any public comments on this agenda item? So our next agenda item is our Levees 101. This is an information item. Believe it or not, this is the first time DPIIC has really discussed levees, apparently. Levees are the backbone of the Delta, as we all know, and the co-equal goals cannot be furthered without a strong levee system. Today's meeting and the series of panels we've prepared are designed to help all of us gradually go deeper into the myriad of interrelated levee topics. Our first panel, aptly named Levees 101, will help us all to understand the who, what, why, and where of our levee system. Our tour will take us up behind us to the top of the levee and Elkhorn Slough. And then this afternoon, we'll dive a little deeper and hear from experts in their fields on several levee-related topics. To kick us off, Erin has joined us with Joe Countryman, Tom Zuckerman, and Chris Williams at the table for our panel. And I'll hand it over to Erin to further introduce the panelists. Thanks.
Is this working? It sounds like it. Good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking the DPIIC committee for having us out here this morning. My name is Erin Mullin, and I am the lead engineer for the Delta Stewardship Council. For those of you that know me, you know that I can speak to Delta levees all day, so I'm going to try and keep my comments brief. We have all day to talk about this topic, but as Julie said, feel free to come up and ask me any questions throughout the day. The Delta levees are what what give us the Delta. Without our levees, we would not have a Delta. A 2017 study that was put out by the Delta Protection Commission found that the greatest beneficiary of Delta levees is actually the state of California. Without the levees, we would not be able to export water to Southern California. We would lose our fisheries, and we would not have the recreation or the agriculture or the transportation corridors. I could go on and on. So this really is the backbone of our Delta. We depend on the levees to protect people, property, agriculture, water supply, the ecosystem. It really is just an exhaustive list of important and critical services that they provide. And so it's a very important system. And it's a complicated system, both from a geological and an engineering perspective, but also from an administrative perspective and and from a policy perspective as well. The reason we're here talking about it today is that every one of your agencies has a hand in the Delta levees or the services that they provide. And we tend to be a little siloed, but as challenges continue, we need to pull together and work together in order to make this system succeed. We need to step out of our silos and communicate and pull together to make the system work. So I would like to once again thank you for convening today and beginning this work. In order to kick off this discussion, we're going to hear from 3 people today. It's just going to be a very quick overview, just kind of a level setting so that we all start from the same place. Then we're going to have the tour and we're going to kind of go up and, talk about, it's going to basically be like a case study where we're going to talk about one particular project. And then this afternoon, we're going to have a panel where we're going to deeper dive into several different topics. So you're going to have an opportunity to hear lots of these issues over and over and over again. So if you feel lost at any point, know that we will probably be revisiting a topic again. In order to hear more about the levees today, we are going to hear from Tom Zuckerman, who is a lifelong Delta resident. He has served in many capacities, including as counsel for the Central Delta Water Agency. We're going to hear from Joe Countryman, who has over 40 years of Delta levee experience. He's an engineer who's worked for the Army Corps of Engineers and currently serves on the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. And we're also going to hear from Chris Williams, who is the principal engineer for DWR, who is in charge of the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tom.
Thank you very much.
Is this mic live?
No.
Is it working now? I'm going to try to set the stage a little bit for those of you who may not be as familiar with our Delta and how it evolved over time. And then ultimately, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the functions that the levees provide, particularly the so-called private levees or the non-project levees. But go back to when California was admitted to the Union, 1849, because the population of this area was growing by leaps and bounds because of the gold rush. In 1850, the federal government passed a law called the Arkansas Act, otherwise known as the Swamp Act of 1850, which deeded to the various states swamp and overflow lands that were contained within their boundaries, on the condition that they transferred them into private ownership conditionally. And the condition was that the people that sought the patents for ownership of the land had to reclaim the land, build levees, provide flood control, and to do that for agriculture or commercial purposes. I mention that because in that stage of the game, there was no mention of the other functions that the levees currently provide, which we'll get into in a bit. So there were natural levees that supported the flows of the river. There weren't any dams in the mountains at that time. This slough right here, named Steamboat Slough, when you go up and look at it, it's hard to believe, but it was kind of the main thoroughfare from the Bay Area up to the Sacramento area. The steamships came up there. Today, of course, they would come up the Sacramento River, which has been improved with federal levees, incidentally. So it was a bit of a homestead type of a legislation where they were trying to get people into the farming in the Delta to supply the food that the growing population was requiring. And there were acreage limitations on the amount of land that anybody could apply for at 320 acres at that time. That proved to be completely infeasible because other than the very peripheries of the Delta that were on higher land, it was very difficult to build and maintain a levee around 320 acres. It wasn't feasible. And add to the fact that the hydraulic mining from the Sierras and the Coast Range was adding material to the channel bottoms, which was constantly raising the river and reducing the flood carrying capacity. So it was a real challenge to develop and reclaim most of this land. What changed it more than anything else was the arrival of the clamshell dredger in 1892. And now we had a facility that could reach out and grab the sediments from the bottom of the river channel itself and use that to build levees rather than the peat soils, which were very friable and very, very difficult to maintain. So from 1892 to about 1920, almost all the levees that you see today in the Delta were first constructed. And they were not constructed as federal levees at that time, and these gentlemen will get into that. That was an overlay that came along later as the federal interest in preserving some of those levees was evidenced. So the levee pattern was built for farming, basically. It wasn't really established until the first part of the 20th century. And those levees are pretty much in the same locations today that they were 100 years ago. And you won't see a typical agricultural levee here, but maybe at other times you'll get out into the Delta. And what you'll see is a series of levees that have been engineered locally on top of historical levees that had various kinds of foundation problems underneath them and gave rise to a lot of difficulty in maintaining those levees against floodwaters. And most of the islands in the Delta, of which there's about 60 main leveed islands, have flooded at least 3 times, sometime since their first reclamation. Interestingly enough, and importantly to understand, is that beginning in the early 1970s, after one of the major islands, Andros Island, flooded here, which contains, among other things, State Highway 12, the federal government and the state government began to realize that there was an interest beyond just farming for the local farmers to maintain the levees, and they began to institute some compensation plans that helped the local reclamation districts maintain the levees. Senator Howard Way in, I think, 1973, 72, somewhere along there, right after the Andros flood, sponsored legislation that began modest fiscal help to the local reclamation districts. And I should point out that each of the islands has at least one reclamation district that is coincident with the levees around the particular Delta. So each island is its own public agency. And they were formed that way in order to facilitate the sale of bonds, which enabled the landowners at that time to construct the original levees. But those reclamation districts continue to exist today. So after the onset of some help, and the original thing is called the Delta Subventions Program, we began to see accelerated maintenance of the levees in the Delta. And actually, it became more meaningful after the floods in the 80s. And I'm proud to say that today we have not had a catastrophic levee failure in the Delta for, I think, 27 years. And if you go back before that, the levees were constantly failing. So it's been the most effective, in my opinion, infrastructure program that the state of California has had during that period of time. The levees serve many purposes. Erin's sheet that was distributed, I think, before you really illustrates all that, and I won't go into all that. But it is important to note, and particularly for those of you who represent federal agencies here, that the federal government really hasn't been involved in the maintenance and improvement of the non-project levees in the Delta, which constitute about 2/3 of the Delta. And some of those levees are very instrumental to protecting water transfer, urban populations, and so forth. But the federal government has gotten involved when we've had levee failures and disasters. And unfortunately, the amount of money that has to be spent in order to reclaim one of these islands after it's already flooded is many times the amount that it takes to maintain those levees, to keep them from flooding. So my editorial statement here would be that it's a shame that the federal government hasn't figured out how to become more involved in maintaining the non-project levees in the Delta, and thereby being able to save the taxpayers enormous amounts of money from when we do have catastrophic floods. We haven't had one recently, but we came very close last week. And we're not exactly sure what the cause of that was, but a long section of levee on Victoria Island, which Victoria Island sits astride the two major water courses that the water is transferred across the Delta to the export pumps for the federal project and for the state project. And a long section of that levee appears to have been undermined by erosion, possibly caused either by the concentration of the flows to the pumps or the high water that's occurred in the last couple of years coming down those branches of the San Joaquin River. But nevertheless, just to know that we're not out of the woods, that was a fairly close call in terms of a complete levee failure there on Victoria Island. And I point that out because Highway 4 crosses Victoria Island, plus the levees of that island are very instrumental in supporting the ability of the federal government and the state to transfer water for export. That's more time than I probably was allotted, but that's as fast as I can do it. Thank you.
If I could just add one thing to Tom's story about Victoria Island, it's a very good example of state interests in the Delta. In addition to it being important for water exports, he mentioned that Highway 4 runs across Victoria Island. Caltrans does not contribute anything to the maintenance of the levees on Victoria Island, even though they depend on the levees in order to preserve and protect Highway 4. It's just, and that's not a fault of Caltrans, it's just the way that their authority works. They're not allowed to pay for flood protection beyond a certain easement on either side of their highway. And so that's just, and when I talk about the administration of the infrastructure of California, that's one of the nuances that we have to tackle when it comes to how we basically govern our state and raise funding and how we pay for things and how we govern ourselves. So I just wanted to make sure that that point was driven home. Thank you, Tom. And now I'm going to hand it over to Chris.
Let's see, is this working? Try this.
Yes.
Okay. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Christopher Williams with California Department of Water Resources. Today I'm going to discuss project levees in the Delta. Project levees are also known as state plan of flood control levees, and you can refer to them by either name. These are those levees that are through a partnership with the federal government, and the state of California and local interests have made assurances that they're going to maintain those levees. Many of them were built long ago, as Tom was saying, by local farming interests, using materials at hand with primitive activities such as dredging, clamshell dredging, and whatnot. Going all the way back to the 1850s, some of these early levees were brought into the state plan of flood control when Congress authorized the Sacramento River Flood Control Project in 1917. The Delta levees not only protect vital agricultural lands, Delta communities, and water conveyance, but they also provide a very critical flood reduction function. And they do become vulnerable in the face of climate change, shifting priorities, and funding gaps. That's why it's so critical to have the Delta top of mind when planning for the future. I want to start with some numbers and context. There's about 1,100 miles of Delta levees that you know of. About a third of those, as Tom had said, are state plan of flood control levees. So there's about 380 miles of state plan of flood control levees within the legal Delta. Zooming out a little bit to talk about the entire Central Valley, all-inclusive, there's 1,600, a little over 1,600 miles of project levees within the Sacramento and the San Joaquin basins and the legal Delta. So with 380 miles, that's about a quarter of the entire state plan of flood control project levees that are in the Delta. So the Delta levees, the project levees, are asked to do a lot more than some of the river levees upstream and the rest of the state plan of flood control. For one of the things that distinguishes the state plan of flood control project levees in the Delta is many of them are asked to be performed 24/7. They're constantly wet all the time. And just this being, despite not being constructed with strict engineering standards, they still have to withstand that constant pressure and deal with tides, wind, boat wakes, and they're expected to function as they are all the time. So that's what makes the Delta State Plan of Flood Control project levees so unique. They also face a lot of unique challenges and considerations that continue evolving over time, and some are exacerbated with climate change. Things such as major floods, earthquakes, rising sea levels, changes in economic activity, farming interests, and also changes in state and federal legislation. But also there's evolving values that Californians have. Besides the farming interest in the Delta, there's growing interest, as you know, in ecosystem uplift, recreation, and recognition of the Delta as a place. For example, in 2019, as we all know, it was recognized as the first national heritage area in California. So we need these project levees in the Delta because they protect so much. They protect urban areas and small communities. They protect major conveyance corridors and also critical infrastructure and much more. But how do we make sure that these project levees continue to do that? Well, it's through careful planning, and that's how planning comes in. The project levees in the Delta are a critical component of our planning efforts with the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, also known as the CVFPP. Every 5 years, the Department of Water Resources develops and updates the CVFPP, which provides a strategic blueprint for flood risk management in the Central Valley, while also protecting ecosystems and supporting watershed management. It's actually one of the most comprehensive flood risk management endeavors ever undertaken in California. It lays out strategies to prioritize investment in flood management over a 30-year planning horizon focused on the state plan of flood control, promote multi-benefit projects, and also integrate and improve ecosystem functions associated with flood risk reduction projects. I want to give you a little example of some of the things within the Delta that the CVFPP recommendations include. They include levee improvements to urban and small communities. These would be improvements to the areas of West Sacramento, as well as some of the small communities such as Clarksburg, Hood, Cortland, Walnut Grove, Isleton, Rio Vista, and Locke. Also continued climate change modeling, emergency response grants and exercises, and increasing material stockpiles within the Delta. And also continued planning, such as the Delta Levee System Integrity 5-year plans. We have a strong interest in the Delta with the CVFPP because of how important the Delta is to the larger SPFC system. And I will say this is one of the things that I like to talk about is that, you know, all of California, you look at about 40% of the runoff that happens in the state of California flows through the Delta. But when you're talking about the CVFPP system-wide planning area in the Sacramento and San Joaquin basins, it's a much larger number. In fact, most all of our flows end up in the Delta at some point. So it is our downstream boundary condition. Anything that we recommend upstream, any kind of improvements, does affect the Delta. And so we can't have successful planning without prioritizing a healthy Delta. And I know we're moving quick on time, so that's about all I have, and I'll turn it over to Joe.
Right.
Okay, thank you. I'm again Joe Countryman, and I'm with the member of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. Our board is responsible for overseeing the operation and maintenance of the state plan of flood control levees. Those are the federal levees that were discussed earlier. We perform inspections on the levees. We hear from the Corps of Engineers, who also provides inspections. And we see and follow up as the best we can to see that this work is done correctly to maintain the levee system. The non-project levees don't have that benefit. We don't inspect non-project levees. We do review major work that goes on these levees, not the operation and maintenance. And I hate to disappoint Tom, but the federal government will not spend money on operation and maintenance of levees. That is nationwide. They do not do that, except, well, there are some exceptions, but like the Mississippi River Project, for instance. But so we also oversee the Delta Levee Subventions Program that was mentioned earlier. And that's a cost-sharing program that allows the local districts to come in with something like 30% of the money, and the state will pay 70%. Then only the non-project levies are really can take advantage of that. And so it was designed for those non-project levies. And like Tom said, it's been highly successful. And we hope that we can find funds. I think we're running low, very low on funds, but we're hoping that we'll find a way to continue that program in the future. See here. I think that's, I think everything was said by everybody here, so I won't go on with anymore.
I just wanted to kind of wrap it up by making a few final statements. The Delta is a place of change. It's the transition zone between the riverine system and the ocean. It's, you know, as Chris mentioned, it's where the valley empties out into the sea, basically. And it is such a critical part of our state. It's a place of critical infrastructure. It's a piece of critical you know, it's a very important estuary. It's just such a vital part of what makes California like a special place. And this relationship that you see at this table has been hard fought. And you know, over the time since the council was created in 2009, we have worked to build bridges in order to protect, in order to steward the Delta in the right direction. And I want to thank the people that are here with me today and express my gratitude for their participation on this panel. So that's it. And now I hand it back over to Julie. Thank you.
Very well said. So first I'll ask any of our members if we have questions for our panelists. As we mentioned, we're going to have some lightning talks this afternoon and dive into some really specific, deeper topics. So we may want to wait, you know, on a few questions that we think might be covered this afternoon, but please feel free if you feel like you have any burning questions that we want to ask now. Yes, Diane.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm really, really excited that we're talking about levees. I think sometimes folks just think they're the barrier that holds the water back, but doesn't really, and you know, we don't really see all of the different purposes and benefits of levees. So the subvention program, has that in my understanding has never been actually a dedicated budget thing. It's always been kind of brought in with DWR money. Is that, am I misunderstanding?
Well, it's based on availability of funds, and currently we're operating on propositions that were passed. The Flood Prevention Act of 2006, Proposition 1E, and the Flood Control and River and Coastal Protection Board Act of 2006, or yeah, also 2006.
But all
So,
those are,
so when those funds run out, there's nothing from the general fund available, and we really need to find some way to get a continuation of the funding for that program because it's,
yeah, I wanted to emphasize that because I think there's a lot of concern on the part of a lot of folks that money is not going to be there. And as was pointed out, the investment of maintaining and improving is much smaller than the break. Tom, did you want to say something?
Well, I suppose we shouldn't be politicking this close to the
Oh, why not?
elections, but the money that's available for both the subventions program and the special projects programs running out from those bonds. There's a Proposition 4 on the ballot week from Tuesday or whenever it is that would restore funding for a few years to the program. And those of you who are residents of California and not felons or whatever, please go to the ballot box and vote for Proposition 4.
So the other question I have 3 questions. What percentage of the levees in the Delta are non-project levees?
about 2/3.
About 2/3. So in other words, one third is got a lot of care and attention. The other 2/3, they got to wing it.
One thing I didn't say earlier is that the project levies, there's a federal law called PL 8499 that provides funding for flood fights and if there's a levee failure for the rehabilitation of the levee, the rebuilding of the levee and everything that would go with it. But that's only available, the rehab part is only available on state plan of flood control levies. It's not available for the non-project levies. And the most recent levee failure that occurred, the state of California had to step up and close the breach, pump the water out. And I can't remember right now what the total cost of that was, but it was very high. So that's another reason why we need to maintain these non-project levies as well as the project levies, is because the state is the last source of funding to recover.
And the non-project levies, in order to become a project levy, there's a lot of hoops you need to jump through and boxes you need to check, and it's not easy. Am I correct?
Well, it doesn't quite work like that. You can't become a project levy just by doing something. You have to, when the construction was originally done, the state of California gave assurances to the federal government that they would be operated and maintained and provided the lands and rights of way for that. So you actually need an authorized federal project for it to become a state plan of flood control levy, which is really very difficult, probably impossible to do.
Does it take an act of Congress?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's not easy to become a project levy if you're not already one.
That's right.
Okay. And then just last question, you kind of got my interest on Victoria Island. Were you guys inspecting that, or what was the challenge? Do we know why there was the issues they're having?
Well, it's a non-project levy, so we don't inspect it.
Okay.
Tom thought he offered some possibilities.
These levees are regularly inspected, by the reclamation districts, and but some of these things are very hard to discern. Usually, when we lose a levee in the Delta, it's not from overtopping, but it occurs when there's a lot of pressure on the levee. It's a combination of storms, tides, and atmospheric pressure that combine to force the water to stay in the Delta from the winds that come offshore and all this other stuff. But typically it's not overtopping. What happens is there's some kind of a structural failure in the levee itself. Frequently it's caused by beaver dens that are very difficult to find. But we try to find those things. This particular one, it appears to be an erosion problem at the base of the levee, which is out of sight and very difficult to understand. But yes, on the water side. Yes, we do inspect these levees regularly. The reclamation districts do. They have 5-year plans, which they submit to the Department of Water Resources to show what their current status is, levee heights and cross sections and so forth. And it's not being ignored.
Thank you.
No worries, we're on time. Yes, Jay.
I want to thank the panel for the overview and for your continued involvement in kind of maintaining some integrity in our completely dependent Delta status on these levees. So I just want to kind of underscore that point. As an optimist, I'd say if Prop 4 were to pass, we have several $100 million potentially to infuse into the Delta Levee Subvention Program. I'd like to ask the panel how we might leverage that funding most effectively, perhaps even to push the Corps into a more active position in participating in ongoing levee maintenance programs.
Well, again, I don't want to disappoint you, but the Corps will not spend money on levee maintenance. That's for Bogle. So that's not going to happen. Now, one thing is that the money that we do have, I mentioned that there's a 70% state share and 30% local share, but the locals have actually been averaging about 50% share. So the money is being leveraged as far as the its utilization, because the local landowners have put more money in than the 30% minimum.
If I could jump in on that, something that hasn't been mentioned so far, we did this panel at the council meeting on Thursday, and this was brought up then, but it hasn't been brought up today. So one of the challenges with engaging the Corps in the Delta levees is that the Corps does not have a water supply mission, or it doesn't have water supply as part of its mission statement. And so that's one of the difficulties in engaging the Corps in operations and maintenance in the Delta levees, since such a big interest in maintaining the Delta levees is for their function in water supply and water quality. And so without that interest, it's harder for them to see a reason to participate in their operations and maintenance or improvement. So that's one of the challenges that we have. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Yes, please. Go ahead.
Is this on? It is that button. Okay, great. Josephine Axe with the Army Corps of Engineers, Chief of Planning in our regional headquarters. Mr. Countryman did an excellent job laying out the limitations and constraints that the Corps of Engineers is under. And the last 40 or so years, when we work with a non-federal sponsor and plan, design, and then construct a project, the O&M is the responsibility of the non-federal sponsor. There are instances in the past where the Corps, that transfer didn't happen, and the Corps still is responsible in certain situations for O&M. But again, I think it was Mr. Countryman answering your question about how do you become a project levy, to use the language we're using today. And that doesn't happen unless you have congressional authorization to build a project with the Corps of Engineers, and then again we would turn over the O&M. So it's very complicated, and there's lots of authorities and delegations, et cetera. I'm happy to answer questions now or during our tour. In terms of water supply, it's not considered a primary mission area for the Corps of Engineers. We have 3 of them, but we do engage in that, again, depending on different authorities that a facility might have. You know, we've got different dams and reservoirs that have what we call in the West water conservation ability. Recently, through Water Resources Development Acts, Congress is very interested in giving the Corps additional authority to work with sponsors on things like water conservation, drought resilience. So I feel like that's a really active area of engagement going forward. It's a recognition that, yeah, a lot of the infrastructure has to be used, shouldn't say has to. There's benefits to using our infrastructure in multi-benefit ways, and we want to be a part of that.
Thank you. And I think, Jake, you wanted to make a comment as well. And then I think we'll make this our last one because we need to get up to the levee, and we are going to have our talks this afternoon. So we'll have lots more time for interaction, but I want to make sure we give public comment time as well. So go ahead, Jake.
Great, thank you. With 60 levees, 60 islands that are levied throughout the Delta, then the management and decision-making processes around them are often situational and or sort of independent or unique. And I was wondering if you could paint me a picture of how the decision processes work using, for example, Van Sickle Island, or another island. Just happen to know about that one. I'm kind of curious about the recent history there. What are the decision processes that are made on a non-project island about whether to allow a breach to occur or allow flood to occur and not try to restore, quote unquote. And I'm very new to the whole system. Only know about that through looking at Google Maps, and I can see water flowing in and out of it, and et cetera. So just kind of curious about that particular island, but maybe we could use that as just to quickly paint a picture of who makes those decisions. And that's a particularly critical location, a choke point there, right, where the rivers come together and sort of separate it from the larger bay area. So you might have salt and organisms and shipping and sediment transport and whatnot through there. So if somebody knows something about that, that would be great.
Well, I don't know very much about Van Sickle Island, but in my mind, it's not a levied agricultural island. And I don't know whether there's even a reclamation district there. I don't know that. But to answer in general, the way this happens is that the process has gotten somewhat standardized by the Department of Water Resources administering the Delta Levee Subventions Program. The state and the federal government both have levee design standards. The state of California is the one that we pay the most attention to at the moment. And as I said, each of the levee districts, the reclamation districts, is required to update every 5 years a plan, which they submit to the department for review and comment and so forth. So that tends to standardize what's going on. There's common postings on the islands for be able to establish the locations of one thing or another, and it's pretty well done that way. The other thing I would just say, and it's just very informal, but there are really a very limited number of engineering firms that are active in the Delta, and two of those firms, one of which this gentleman is an alumnus of, probably provide their services to about 80% of the islands in the Delta. So that becomes a big process for standardizing what's going on.
Just add one quick thing. There is no island that is designated for failure. I mean, I got a hint from. I have a hint.
There's somebody up there.
Sorry, we're distracted by the fire.
Oh.
Yeah, we see. So it looks like there's a planned little fire over here on the side. So we weren't really aware of that. Great timing for us, but we'll work around it. Hopefully they're just doing a quick little burn off and we can get up there for our visit with no problem. So go ahead, Joe. Please
but
finish your
Jake,
thought.
there's no island that's been designated for failure. They all are. If there's a problem, there's a flood fight that goes on, and there is federal money even available to do flood fight work. But when it fails, The question is, how do we repair it? It's very expensive to close those gaps once they break, and then they have to pump the water out, which is extremely expensive. So, and that's where the state ends up stepping in and making it. So far, the state's been making the decision to do that, but you don't know, I mean.
Jake, I know we're short on time, but I just want to say that I love your question, and I think you maybe have asked the most important question so far today. I think that's really important that most people don't understand is that even though the reclamation districts are technically considered local government, they really are businesses. They are tiny independent businesses run by the landowners on each of these islands. So the decision, and so even though each of these islands serves all of those purposes, they help protect shipping canals and nutrients, and they hold back salinity, and they do all of these things. The work to keep the levees up and maintain the levees and fight the floods are all done by these local businesses. And if it doesn't make business sense for them to continue to do that because it becomes too salty to farm, farming just becomes untenable. They don't have the economy to keep it going. They may make the decision to not operate or maintain those levees anymore because they are local businesses and they have no obligation to continue to do that. And I think that that's something that's not very well understood. That is a difference between the project and the non-project levies. The project levies do not have the ability to just walk away because we have given assurances. We have promised the Army, we have promised the federal government that we will operate and maintain those levees. But that's not true with the non-project levies. So that is kind of an important point, and I'm really glad that you asked that question. Thank you.
Great. Do we have any public comments on this agenda item? Yes, sir.
You can just speak loud and you'll be picked up on that.
My name is Dominic Gould, the owner of Green Mountain Engineering. I'm the third engineering company that watches levees, and I've worked here. For 30 years, I've worked in the Delta. For 10 years, I worked for Dutra Construction, and then I opened my own business, and I took over a bunch of levees, or started working with a man named Tom Roston, who had, at that time, probably over a dozen levees. Tom took over for a guy named George Rabb, who used to watch all the levees, and George took over for his dad, George Rabb Sr. But anyways, the levees that I've worked on have been under the same group of engineers for years, all non-project levies. And the subventions program is great. We spend as much money as we can using that program. But previously, we had Proposition 84 and 1E that did a lot of funding. And it funded specifically the aqueduct levees, which is the East Bay Mud Aqueduct, which runs right through the Delta. It goes through Brookside, then it goes through Roberts Island, then it goes through Jones Tract, and then it goes to Woodward, and then it goes through Palm and Orwood Tract. And that money, 84 and 1E, was dedicated to protect, 70 million of it or so was dedicated to protecting those East Bay Mud Islands. So we were fortunate to get a lot of that money, and it went a long way. Our levees are fantastic now. Jones Tract, which broke in 2004, was one of those levees. And Jones Tract right now, I can drive around the entire island at about 50 miles an hour. Our levee's huge in some areas because we built supersized levees. We planted trees on the levees. The point I'm making is that those bonds did a lot for the East Bay Mud Islands. But to Ms. Borges' point, we don't have a steady source of income. Okay, subventions is great, but it's all funded by how much my farmers can afford, and that's nothing. Okay, Terminus Tract spent bill last month for pumping water because all the islands, every drop of water that comes in has to get pumped out. And our bill last month was $90,000. Okay, we have no money. Terminus is $1 million in debt, so subventions is great, but we don't have the money to go and build a huge tow berm. But in order to we do 5-year plans, which are great. You know, we say, hey, here's 5-year plans. If all the money were available, this is what it would take in 5 years. But for us to fund that, it would take us 1,000 years to try and do something like that. So, Sportis, you're right. We do need a source of funding that can be consistent for rehabilitation. I think the Corps, they did help out with Jones Track. When it broke, Trapper Slough was below and was going to go over to Highway 4. We fixed it in a weekend. So, you know, the bonds, you know, this bond that's coming out has money. Yes. Prop 1 had money for the Delta. We haven't seen any of it. It's all being spent up here. There's a lot of pet projects that get spent on. Lookout Slough up here. We did a job on Jones Track, and I've seen trucks for 2 weeks running out to Bacon Island, running rock out there. Bacon Island, Golden Island, and Webb Track are all owned by Metropolitan Water District. And somehow they're finding money to spend on those islands. So that's great. The money's out there. And Ms. Borges, I just want to compliment you on your comments because you started to get very educated on this subject, and it's appreciated. So the point I'm making is we need money. We can't afford it. One time, Bill Edgar of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, we only spent like $8 million in the subvention program. He goes, how come people aren't spending the money? It's because we can't afford it. We have no money. We'd love to spend the money, but this is a state interest, okay? The levees protect, even if they build the tunnel, that only protects 15% of the water, okay? The levees need to be rehabilitated for water. So you guys are relying on my farmers to protect Highway 12, for example, this terminus track. That means $40 million to get it up to the standard that the East Bay Mud Islands are up to now. We can't afford it. Don't rely on us to protect your highways. You need to get the state, it could be the feds or somebody, but.
Thanks, Dominic. We appreciate your comments very much. Really appreciate that. Any other public comment? All right, I think it's just about time to go up to the top of the levee, and we're going to hear from Gil Cosio, Tom Slater, and Campbell Ingram. Just a couple of items. Once we're assembled on top of the levee, Erin will frame our walk and our talk. So just remember, obviously, we're on an active country road. We're going to go up the steps here behind me and up the driveway. We'll have a few key staff in safety vests around us to keep an eye on traffic. Henry, Dylan, Emma, and Amanda, please wave your hands so everybody can see you. There we go. Be cautious. We've got cones placed around the edge of the levee, so please stay to the inside of the cones. Henry, Dylan, and Emma will be on either side of us, catching traffic going in both directions. And Amanda will be amongst us and watching Emma and Henry and Dylan. So if we need to move over, please listen to Amanda. All right, so thank you very much, and we will go up to the top of the levee. And after that, we'll do our lunch break. So I'll call our October 28th DPIIC meeting back to order at 12:45 p.m. So welcome to our afternoon panel. They're going to go a bit more in depth into several levee-related topics, and the council's Jessica Pearson is going to moderate this panel. So I'll turn it over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Chair Lee. As we heard this morning in session and while on the levee, flood and levee management in the Delta is quite complex, but it's also a defining aspect of the Delta. We've been calling it the backbone of the co-equal goals, protecting habitats, the agricultural lands that fuel the Delta's economic engine and way of life. And of course, levees comprise the through Delta conveyance system that supplies millions of Californians with water. So on this panel, we're going to dive deeper, so maybe call it a Levees 201, into many of the topics that run the gamut related to Delta levees. We will attempt to do this in short form with a series of lightning talks, and our goal with this panel is to elevate the multiple benefits of levees, the need for more reliable funding, the value of vegetation on levees in the Delta, and really just to achieve better understanding in general among this body of Delta levee challenges and opportunities. Each of our speakers will have 3 to 5 minutes max to discuss their specific topic, and then we'll have a group discussion about the issues. There is a timer, and Emma, standing over there behind the bar, will show you when you have a 1-minute warning, 1 minute left. So with us today, we have on the topic of maintenance, Emily Papalardo, professional engineer from DCC Engineering. We also have on the topic of seismic, Dr. Tom Holzer, Delta Independent Science Board. On the topic of urban levees, Glenn Prasad from the San Joaquin Area Flood Control Agency. On the topic of state funding, Brian Brock, Department of Water Resources. On local funding, Gil Cosio, professional engineer, River Delta Consulting. Levees as habitat, we have Angela Calderaro, Department of Water Resources. On water supply reliability, we have Randall Nudek from Metropolitan Water Agency. And on proposed vegetation standards, we welcome Lorena Guerrero from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Emily Papalardo, who's going to talk about levee maintenance. Emily?
Thank you, Jessica. Maintenance is critical. Just as we would go take our cars in for maintenance or do maintenance on our air conditioning systems, these types of situations, you got to make sure you catch the problems early before they get really expensive. And so these things are available when you need them. Levees are a very similar concept to that. Reclamation districts are the agencies that do the maintenance on the levees. Their activities include vegetation management. As you'll see right here, this is a really nicely maintained levee. So you can see any problems you have to make sure you mow, trim your trees so that you can catch your problems. Another part of that maintenance is catching them before they happen. That's rodent control. So squirrels and beavers can really cause a lot of damage on our levee systems. Particularly a beaver den can look small on the outside, but really be big on the inside. So it's really important to do inspection. Inspection is another part of the maintenance that the reclamation districts do. They inspect on the crown, and it's really important because of these beaver dens. Also do your water side inspections and make sure you're monitoring your whole system, making sure you catch issues or monitor issues that you can't fix immediately. And that goes into the issues that you have to fix. So erosion, seepage, crown management, slope stability, and let's see what else we got here. Oh, and keeping up your patrol roads. Patrol roads are really important. All weather access is really important to responding not only to flood events, but also just being able to inspect it during a wet season. And so the districts only have so much money to do this maintenance, so they have to prioritize how they do the work in a worst first kind of approach. So you're going to take whatever your biggest problem is and try to fix it first, depending on how much money you have, and then kind of plan out your other maintenance activities for other years. Every year, though, you have to do vegetation control so that you can make sure you're seeing what issues are out there and be able to watch them. Some of the issues we have with doing this work is there are regulatory and environmental compliance these districts have to adhere to. So there's work windows. You're only allowed to work in the water between July and October, which is a really tight time to try to get a lot of work done. Additionally, there's ground nesting bird season and raptor nesting that happens between February to August. So you really can't do much there unless you have a biologist out to go assess your area. And then you really shouldn't be doing any work into the flood season, which is November to April. So short story is you got a short time to do a lot of things, and we only have about a handful of contractors that we typically use that are really familiar with the system in this area that you have to schedule all this work in this tiny little window. Of course, there are ways you can work with your agencies to try to get, a longer work time into the flood season. Given it's pretty dry, we could probably work a few more weeks into November. If it continues to be dry, we get more time. But it's a lot more time and money that doesn't go into projects if you're doing all that extra agency coordination. A lot of these districts have routine maintenance agreements with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, which helps with their maintenance activities. They don't have to check in all the time, but they do check in at the end because there is that net enhancement component of maintenance and levee work in the Delta. And then another, there's large districts that have full-time staff and equipment, which helps get a lot of the work done, but a lot of the smaller reclamation districts in the Delta don't have that. So they're reliant on their trustees being informed or their consultants making sure the work gets done as it's supposed to. And there's a little bit of a different way to manage. I think that we already talked about project levies, non-project levies. There's a lot of coordination that needs to happen with the reclamation districts and the state and federal partners. If they want to do a project on these project levies, they can't just go do it. Not necessarily the case for non-project levies, but there's also a lot of agency coordination that needs to happen there because habitat and everything else out here in the Delta. So those are the major things. None of this can happen without the subventions program. It's really important, and it's, that's one of our restrictions too, is we can never plan out far enough because we don't ever really have a guaranteed program funding source. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for staying on time. That was great. Now we're going to turn to Dr. Holzer, who's going to address seismic risk to Delta levees.
Okay, there's 1,100 miles of levees in the Delta, and what an earthquake will do is basically seek out the weakest links in that. And if you stop to think about it, if you calculate like a 1/100% of the levees might be vulnerable, say, just hypothetically, you're talking about 600 feet of levee. We'll chop it up into 50-foot pieces, spread it out in the levees, and you have a pretty vulnerable system. So what you want to know is what your seismic hazard is before you even get into evaluating the levees. And the seismic hazard assessments are actually pretty simple in concept. They've just become complicated in detail. To do a seismic hazard assessment, typically what you'll do is identify the sources where the earthquakes might happen and their frequency, magnitudes. And then after you do that, you calculate the ground motion. So the ultimate prediction is a level of ground motion. And you do all this probabilistically, so you have some idea of the frequency. So you know whether it's likely in 200 years or in, say, 2,500 years. And it turns out in the levee system here in California, the DREAM study suggests it's probably the longer time period. So you're dealing with a hazard that's not going to happen very frequently, every 2,500 years, but it could be potentially devastating if the levees aren't built to that standard. Now, what I'd like to do is just do a quick trip through that analysis. So if you do a study for the Delta, what you're going to, of course, focus on are the famous faults, the San Andreas and the Hayward fault to the west of us. But what you quickly learn is they're about 40, 50 miles away. And if you look at the ground motion from earthquakes, typically it decays exponentially. And by the time you're about 10 miles away from the fault, so a width of 20 miles is going to be experiencing strong ground motion. So even before you do the calculations, you can see that you're going to not be expecting those more famous faults that happen frequently to be occurring and influencing the stability of the levees. So you need to look more carefully into the Delta, and it turns out we have buried faults in the Delta. Some of them are quite old. In fact, the one that appears to be the most threatening, the Minden fault, which is within the Delta, but a little bit to the west and west of here. That fault is probably capable of about a 7.2 earthquake based on its length. But we're looking at ground motions in that 2,500 year frame. And it turns out that fault, even though it's older than the San Andreas, is much more challenging to study because it was responsible for the Rio Vista gas field. And then in recent times, it's actually reversed its sense of movement. And so to the geologist, it's just a more challenging fault to study. But what it means is that you're going to have a fault that appears to be capable with a very low slip rate, so it's probably not going to be happening very often. And you're stuck with a real challenge in terms of evaluating your hazard. The other aspect that probably has changed since the dream studies, we probably have a better understanding of how to predict ground motion. And so if we were to come back and do a study of the delta, we would probably be able to improve our ground motion predictions. And so what we're left with in terms of the seismic problem in the delta is it looks like we have an active fault, but it's not very active. It's capable of big earthquakes. We know there are faults around the delta. There was an earthquake, a series of earthquakes in 1892, the Vacaville Withers earthquakes, that if they had happened in the delta would have been catastrophic. So we know there's the potential there, but trying to define it in a rigorous manner is the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And next we go to Glenn Prasad, who's going to address urban levees.
Thank you, members of the committee and dear colleagues. My name is Glenn Prasad. I'm with the San Joaquin Area Flood Control Agency. We call it SAJAFCA, and we manage and protect our community in Stockton from flood risk. So we back up from the microphone is in. So our member agencies include the cities of Manteca, Lathrop, and city of Stockton, and the San Joaquin County and the San Joaquin County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. And really what I'm here to describe today is the unique success story that we've had in implementation of a really large capital improvement project, levee improvement project in the Stockton area. As I said, our mission and purpose is to protect and minimize flood risk in our community. California's weather pattern has been shifting from times of high water to times of little water. And that poses a unique challenge when it comes to the managing of levees and also the degradation of the levees that we've seen over the years. And so meanwhile, there are several federal and state regulations that also pose challenges to our community as we wrestle with the other climate change and other risks that our community faces. So, but overall, our biggest challenge, or one of our biggest challenge, is funding and getting community buy-in. And that is really the challenge. That is really the problem statement, is how do you implement billions of dollars of levee improvement projects in a community that is significantly and severely disadvantaged. And while we have not secured our entire funding, we do celebrate the small successes that we have as we march towards full implementation. And I'm here to describe some of them here. Lower San Joaquin Phase 1, River Phase 1 project is a $1.3 billion project. And thankfully, due to our partnership with the federal government, the U.S. Army Corps and Central Valley Flood Protection Board, they garnered for us 90% of the funding that's needed to implement that project. That still meant that the local community had to come up with the 10%, which is a very big number. And so in 2023, we successfully were able to secure that through the levee channel and maintenance assessment. So our community is self-assessing themselves to come up with these large amounts of funding that is necessary to do this. And how are we doing that? Like I said, we manage and leverage our relationships with our partners, and we also drive key messaging in our community. Then we have Smith Canal Gate Project, which was just recently completed. Our ribbon cutting was last Wednesday, right in the center of our Flood Preparedness Week. Thanks for all who attended. That was a massive success for our community. A total planning, design, and construction for that project was over $100 million. Then we have Phase 2, which is the Mossdale Track Area Program. The unique feature in this project is that not only are we looking at flood risk reduction, but we're going beyond and looking at wise use of flood planning or floodplain planning. We're also looking at ecosystem restoration opportunities. We're also looking at nature-based features and integrating all of these into a cohesive program. And once again, we have federal partners doing our feasibility study on that project. And also we have our partner, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board and Department of Water Resources joining us there. Then we also have the Paradise Cut Bypass Expansion Project. It's a very unique project, provides us the flood risk reduction we need, but it provides an enormous opportunity for ecosystem restoration. It's located about 8 miles downstream of the confluence of Stanislaus and the San Joaquin rivers. And once again, we're really excited about that project as well. So just lastly, none of this would be possible without our partners. Well, as I already mentioned 3 times, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Flood Board, the Department of Water Resources, the extensive amount of resource agencies that partner with us on these efforts, the non-governmental organizations that are in support and drive the messaging that's needed, and last but not least, the citizens who come out and give us a resounding yes on the ballot. And that's kind of the reason for our success so far on these projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. And now Brian Brock is going to address state funding.
Let's see how loud my voice is. Usually I have to sit way back. I'm Brian Brock. I work for the Department of Water Resources. I manage a couple of programs within the Department of Water Resources, including the Delta Levee Subventions Program and the Special Projects Program, amongst some other programs that we have in our group. And, you know, ultimately, all of this stuff that we're talking about costs money, right? We recently had all of our 70 plus islands, reclamation districts in the Delta do a 5-year plan. And they identified more than 1.5 billion with a B dollars of needs in order to bring their levees up to certain standards that either the federal government or the Department of Water Resources has identified as being the standard, the appropriate standard for those levees. $1.5 billion. Over the last, I'm going to say 15, 20 years, we've been highly subsidized, and we've utilized proposition funding that has been on the ballot, has been approved by the voters, and then we give that money out to the local reclamation districts to perform levee work, multi-benefit projects, and things of that nature. There's always a cost share. Whether that be through the subventions program for routine maintenance. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? So that's a very, very important program. And Emily identified that, you know, propositions are not a stable funding source out there. We get them periodically. Prop 4 is the most recent one that's going to be on the ballot. With every proposition, there are nuances, including in Prop 4, it states that we can't use any of that money for mitigation. And as we'll hear, that's a very important part of our program. You notice all of the trees on the levees. They're not always able to be worked around. Sometimes a levee, I saw a tree fall down as you guys were coming in, you know, that huge branch that's laying out there, that's going to have to be removed and mitigated for in order to do any work on the levee that's a result of that. So there are always challenges to try to implement these programs, including the amount of money that we are granted in order to administer the programs. Very problematic. I think Prop 4 has 7.5%, which is about out of our 150 million that's earmarked for Delta Levee Subventions Program. That's about a year and a half, 2 years of administration. We have typically a lot of smaller projects that take a lot of, you know, contractual mitigations. We have subventions, 70+ subventions contracts every year that we need a contract, we need payments, we have reviews and things of that nature. We've got a staff of about 4 individuals, some of which are here today, to review all of that stuff. And these things, cost money. And unfortunately, we're not in the perfect world yet where we can, A, have stable funding, and B, have enough resources to operate, maintain, manage the system. So, I think in the future, it's going to be really important to try to figure out how we're going to get this stable funding source and not necessarily just rely on a periodic basis for some of these propositions. Prop 218, I'm sure Gil's going to talk about, but that's really limited the amount of money that a local agency can get without having to go out to the voters to try to increase their funding source. So, these are all challenges that we're up against, that I work with every day, that you all likely work with every day. And how are we going to move forward? I think that's up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And now to Gil to address local funding.
Yeah, thank you, committee, for having me today. I've always enjoyed talking about local issues because my whole career has been working for local people. I work for Tom Slater, who's here, and other farmers, and it's really been an enjoyable career to work for. I haven't worked too much for the state or metropolitan or anybody, but the farmers that I've gotten to know and work for, and realize when I go to a meeting, they're pulling money out of their pocket to pay me to be at that meeting. So that's been a lot of responsibility on their hands, very, very enjoyable. So as Tom Slater explained, and we're up on the levee, these reclamation districts pay for their services based on the acreage of crops out here. They have an assessment rate. They have 2 major responsibilities. One is levee maintenance. The second is drainage. A couple of islands, 999 and 2068, also provide water supply. And there's one, Brandon Andrus Levee Maintenance District, that actually protects 3 reclamation districts for their levee maintenance, and then the reclamation districts themselves pay their drainage fees. So the last few years, these assessments have gone up a little bit. And like Brian said, you have to go through a Prop 218 assessment. These are public agencies. The last few assessments, the assessments rate has been about $40 to $50 an acre, which doesn't seem like a lot. But when you go into 1,000 acres of land out here, that's quite a bit of money. And right now, to tell you the truth, all farm commodities are down. If you haven't talked to a farmer lately, they are. Even the grapes that Tom was talking about are down. There's a oversupply, and wineries just aren't buying as many grapes right now. So there's a real struggle to get money out of these districts. I mean, and in addition, the farmers have to pay a bunch of other stuff. They have obviously taxes, they have labor costs, they have fertilizer that's probably gone up twice, 2 times in the last couple of years. They have water quality coalitions. So back in 2003, we lost our non-point source waiver for water quality testing. And so instead of that, every farmer testing their water before it gets put into the drainage system, they have a coalition that actually tests in different areas of the Delta in the open waterways. And if they get a hit for a certain pesticide or herbicide that's too high, they'll follow it back to find out which crop might have been and then deal with it then. That used to be a very nominal fee. And now it's quite significant, probably the $10 to $20 an acre range to get that done. Electricity, back when Melinda Terry started the Flood Control Association, she asked me how much it cost to drain islands. And I think at that time, I estimated most districts spend 30 to 50% of their assessment just for the electricity. Well, if you have PG&E, that electricity's skyrocketed, and these farmers don't get a whole lot of leeway in that too. They try to pump during off-peak hours, but still, it ends up being a lot of money. And then when we have a flood like we did in 23, which was a lot of rain, that's what they pump out of here is rainfall. Those PG&E bills skyrocket. And if what happens in 23 happens again, like in this Clarksburg area, all the power went out for like 3 weeks. And so they got to haul in generators and diesel pumps and whatever you can find. And that's just a budget number that you hadn't planned for. So there's a lot of unforeseen things that happen that could really impact where your assessment goes. And then in this area, when you have project levees, they're always built on the natural levee. And there's a lot of sand on those natural levees. So water's always seeping through these. So even though they're not irrigating or it's not raining right now, their pumps are running because they have to pull the seepage water out so it doesn't harm the trees and other crops that are out here right now. And then also the permitting costs and cost to do work, like replacing pipes and that sort of thing. There are a lot of pipes in these project levees, as Jane well knows, that were probably placed in the 50s or maybe even before. And now they're coming to pay the piper, and it's very expensive. And then also the ratio of acres protected to levee miles is very important. The island downstream of Sutter Island has 2,500 acres of farmland, 12.5 miles of levee. So every 200 acres of farmland pays for about a mile of levee. Grand Island, the next island downstream, with 17,000 acres and 28 miles of levee, they can pay for their levees with about 600 acres per mile. So when Grand Island raises their assessment $10, it's 6,000 acres per mile they can add to their levee cost or levee budget. Whereas Sutter Island, if they raised it $10, it'd be $2,000 a mile. So that's a huge difference, the way the levee's shaped and the amount of ground it protects. And then finally, has been explained in a previous panel, even though there is a subventions program that pays 75% up to after $1,000 a mile, in general, it's been 50-50 if you look at the long-term history. And then to add a little bit to that, it takes about 2 years to get paid. It's a reimbursement program. So if you get paid, if you do work in July 1 of the fiscal year, it's 2 fiscal years later, July 1, that you actually get paid. So it's kind of hard to cash flow it, so they have to borrow money. So there's that kind of cost too. Thank you.
Thank you, Gil. And next on to Angela, who's going to address habitat.
Hi. I wanted to start by first saying we are in a beautiful location. There is wonderful habitat on the other side, but I want to acknowledge that we are working in an extremely, is that good, bad? Okay, thank you. Working in such a changed landscape. Gold Rush era, pre-1949, was so much different than it is today. What once was expansive marsh habitat speckled by riparian is now majority subsided agricultural lands. Depending on where you are in the Delta, you may not even realize you are in the Delta. Traveling by boat, you may see miles upon miles of riprap, and you won't see any riparian. When traveling by car through the Delta, sometimes it's difficult to even see that water until you go over a bridge. I spent some time at Division of Boating and Waterways, and I haven't spent my entire career here in the Delta, but I was shocked at how much riparian habitat is lost. And you travel by boat, and there's just miles upon miles of riprap. Why are we losing all of our endangered species? That's a hard one to answer, right? With all this habitat loss over time. But I really implore you to think about the risks that are associated with this change, this ongoing risk, especially in terms of climate change, as we look at how do we restore habitat to the Delta. With increased subsidence of the islands over time as we farm them, we're seeing that imbalance between higher and higher levees and lower islands. But how do we fix this imbalance to really save us from catastrophes like levees breaking during high flood events or sea level rise? Really, the current land uses are incompatible to long-term solutions in the Delta. Sod farming, for instance, is counterproductive or counterintuitive to retaining soil on the land. But another thing, putting conservation easements on farmland in the Delta to stay there in perpetuity, is that really helping us to combat subsidence in the Delta? We really need to look at the Delta holistically at a landscape level and make changes for long-term sustainability. I would like to push, I'm currently working in Division of Multi-Benefit Initiatives, and I currently just really embrace multi-benefit You know, what can we do to really have nature-based solutions, including subsidence reversal projects, but also putting habitat back on the levees? With Katrina and other events that have happened in the past and other regulatory requirements, there was an old school idea that habitat on levees is bad. We need riprap. We need to shore up all of these trees so that we can see the levee itself. But I'm currently working in the Delta Levees program, and the legislation in the water code that says you must have a net habitat improvement in addition to the no net loss, that is unique. That is so unique to have something that says no matter what, you need to mitigate and you need to provide net habitat improvement. So I used to work for CDFW, and now I get to work with them again in the Delta Levees program. And really, we are working to put habitat back on the levees. But as someone mentioned before, you know, those Prop 4 funds do not include mitigation for these wonderful multi-benefit projects, for our special projects. There's specific language in there that says you cannot use this for mitigation. So even though we, you know, if we can get funds for these special projects and for subventions, we still cannot get mitigation for them. And so then can you move forward with them? Well, mitigation is so expensive. Let me tell you, it is really expensive. And not only is it expensive, it's hard to do. How do you put riparian habitat back on the levee where there may be multiple landowners? Maybe you can't provide any sort of setback. How do you put a conservation easement on something that constantly needs to be maintained? But not only that, we need, and I'm going to say it, we need more funding to manage all of this habitat in the long term because we're being bombarded by invasive species all over. And we don't get money to maintain what we've produced. So we may have 6,500 acres that we've provided for net habitat improvement. We may have provided 350 acres for mitigation, but we need ways to maintain those. So thank you.
Thank you, Angela. And Randall is going to address water supply reliability.
Thank you, Randall Nudak, Metropolitan Water District. I actually wanted to start getting your thoughts on just a couple questions I wanted to ask. And this is a kind of a real situation that's happening right now. Just pretend you're a manager of an island like Gilbert or Brian or Ryan Russ out here, and look out at this levee. There's I don't know if you know, but right now out on Victoria Island, last week about this time, it's about the same slope, a little bit without the trees, the levee dropped 6 feet. And can you imagine 10,000 gallons per minute of water coming out? So just keep that just as you're thinking, what would you do? That's actually going on right now. That's why I walked up late. I was on a call with the Department of Water Resources and the Rec District engineers and others on how they're trying to fix it. They still have a leak in the levee. And then what is your view of the major risk in the Delta? This came up actually during one of our planning sessions, and people asked, well, I've heard people say, well, it's climate change. No, it's sea level rise. Others say, well, it's really seismic events. Others say it's high flood flows. Others say it's beavers and stuff like that. What we've done, and what you may not know, is working with in Delta engineering firms like KSN and MBK, university experts, and even international experts. We've been working trying to solve those issues in two parts. We came out with a kind of a 2 or 3 part solution. One is a modern levee design that can resolve all those issues. And it's not one that just keeps adding to it. It's one that actually integrates it into it. So an example, we don't solve seismic by just adding more beef to the levee. We actually, here's an example. One of the things that Gilbert told us to say, we needed to be able to turn a truck around, a rock truck, because you want to bring rock up to a part that maybe have a problem, right? Well, you need to turn the truck around. You can't just have a crane pick it up and turn it around. Well, that additional width of the levee actually solved the seismic issue. So it's more done in a cost-effective way. The second thing we did is we looked at what types of new monitoring can we go out there to be proactive and reactive? One of the ways we monitor these levees right now is Mr. Ryan will go out in his truck or have a superintendent, they'll roll down the window and look over, and if they see a crack, they'll call, right? That's not a really good methodology for figuring out if you have problems on the levees. So one of the things we've been doing is we've been working with the reclamation districts, DWR and others, with some international firms. We just last week had the Netherlands over. We've had folks from Israel over, and coming up with new technologies. One is we bury a fiber optic or even a coaxial cable in the levee that has sensors on it. It can tell if that levee moves X, Y, or Z. It can tell you where the water is in it. I say, well, that's all good, but has it actually worked? Yes, it has. In fact, I'll get the date wrong, so I'm not going to see the date. It was about 2023. 2023, we had them in the levee and it was moving and we could see it. So luckily, this was a proactive. We knew we had weeks, not hours, okay? We were able to declare an emergency out on that levee. DBR came out, surveyed it, and we put a berm on the backside to stabilize it. During the second one was during the earthquake that happened 6 months ago, 2024. We were in the Delta and we have 4 islands, so we have a lot of area to survey. So we got our crews out there surveying right away, but we had one of our guys get on his phone and say, okay, during our most critical area, that was okay. So we're able to see how far those sensors move and we're able to do that. What I'm showing you is there are solutions out there to these issues, and we're working with not only in Delta interests, but experts from universities, North and Southern California, to find solutions that are done in a cost-effective way. Thank you.
Thank you. And then last but not least, we have Lorena, who's going to discuss vegetation standards and the policy on Delta levees.
All right. So as some of you may be aware, the Army Corps of Engineers has recently stood up the National Levee Safety Program, and you can find all of our documents and guidance at leveesafety.org. So I want you to take away 3 things from this talk today. The first thing is no 2 situations are the same when it comes to vegetation on levees. So the Corps is moving towards a risk-based approach. The second thing is regulatory challenges with vegetation on levees come down to 2 things: delay in action and cost. And the technical challenges are inspection and how to conduct maintenance and flood fighting. So the third thing is the guidance under the National Levee Safety Program is not policy, but discussions about policy are forthcoming. So that is a thing that is going to happen in the future. So what are the best practices for vegetation management on levees? So let's talk about what it is. So what it is it's voluntary guidance on how willing levee owner operators and project proponents can incorporate non-traditional, so i.e., anything other than sod-forming grasses on their levees or manage and maintain existing vegetation. And it's voluntary, so it does cover both project and non-project levees. Let's talk about what it isn't. So it's neither federal policy nor a mandate for levee owner operators to vegetate their levees. So we're not going around and saying, first we said no vegetation, now we're saying all of you have to put vegetation. Not what this is. So what are we proposing? Well, we're proposing a flexible risk-based approach to vegetation management, and this approach is going to capitalize on levee owner operators' knowledge of their systems in the context of the hydraulic, hydrological, ecological, and social context in which they exist. So there's no universal standards or mandates here. Rather, the guidance provides a starting point based on the latest science about how vegetation interacts with engineered structures. So in your handouts, we introduce the concept of zones, and each zone covers a particular portion of the levee progressing from the water side to the land side, and lists the general types of vegetation, such as trees, shrubs, or herbaceous vegetation, the vegetation management practices, and any engineering analysis that would be needed if you wanted to incorporate any additional vegetation onto that levee. So what's the benefit of this approach? Well, it allows flexibility and customization. And the best way to think about this is to conceptualize a tale of 2 levees in California. So one levee may be adjacent to a major waterway. There's a big population behind it that's able to pay fees. They may use it as recreation. And since it's along a natural river, we can expect, being in California, that there's going to be some listed species there. Now, if we contrast this with another levee that's maybe a smaller waterway that only has 1 or 2 property owners adjacent to it, and they've modified the waterway so there may not be any species there, we're going to look at how we consider recommended vegetation there differently. And one of the primary reasons for that is because the levee management regimes are going to differ substantially. So the larger, more well-resourced and visible levee on a major river may have a dedicated levee management staff. They're certainly going to have a bigger budget. They may have a variety of disciplines and specialists that can assist in programming and maintenance. By contrast, the smaller levee district may struggle with funding just to do their day-to-day maintenance and management. So taking on additional vegetation management, someone mentioned the big branch that was down, that costs money, that takes discipline, that takes permits. They just may not be able to take that on. So to summarize, this approach allows both of these levees to select a vegetation management regime that matches their circumstances without the need for some kind of exemption process. So now I do want to clarify that, habitat in these areas, it's not that it doesn't have benefit. A lot of the time it has a lot of benefit. And the reason is because, it's less trafficked. There may be, adjacent benefits from the agricultural habitat nearby. But it's the additional management cost and regulatory burden. So much of this is driven by a lack of funding, particularly funding for that mitigation, which has been mentioned before. We also have issues with flood fighting and those work windows. These are all things that need to be taken into account. And finally, that discussion about how do we inspect? Well, most of the time we drive across the crown of the levee, it's much more challenging to inspect if it's covered in vegetation. So alleviation of these challenges could open the door to allowing the achievement of environmental objectives without compromising flood risk reduction objectives, as much of the science suggests that proper planning and good engineering can overcome the rest. So what does the future hold? Well, we're going to be having that policy discussion. So I'll be gathering names, getting interest so that we can start having those discussions internally. That concludes my discussion.
Thank you so much, and great job, everyone, staying on time. I'm so proud of you. And I'm really in awe of the collective expertise that we have on this panel. So thank you for taking the time. I hope that we can have a lively discussion here. I'm going to ask a few questions to begin with and kind of moderate a conversation here at the table, and then we'll turn it over to DPIIC members who might have questions. So the first question I have, and maybe I might ask Gil to be the first to respond to this one, is given the unique jobs performed by Delta levees, we heard a lot about that today. I've heard advocacy for a Delta levee, a levee standard specific to Delta levees. What would the benefits of that be, and what might that look like, and how would it happen?
Well, the benefits would be that levees that are below a certain standard, and right now the standard we're striving for is the Bulletin 192.82 standard that DWR and the Corps developed in the late 70s. It was explained earlier that after the Brandon Andrus levee broke in 72, there was a study to figure out what do we need to stabilize these levees. There was never a federal project authorized, but the Corps did do an EIS that was never finalized for that. Same thing, the Bulletin 192. So this was a great process. When I first started working in '84, I was able to go through MBK's files and see what happened in the 70s. And it involved academics, it involved the Corps of Engineers, DWR, and all the locals. So they got everybody's input. And so that is the established standard that today is still kind of what we're working on. What Randall explained was something that if we want to deal with seismic at the time, we knew Bulletin 182 didn't deal with seismic. We knew a tow berm would help seismic resistance. So the key is going to be maybe bringing everything up to Bulletin 192.82 because that's the standard, agricultural standard, and then picking and choosing which levees may have other benefits that would require or need a larger rehabilitation, like Randall was talking about, that would resist earthquakes a little more than Bulletin 192.
So who would make that decision?
I thought the Stewardship Council was going to make all those decisions. That's tough. And all the stuff that was talked about habitat and some new features as far as using electromagnetics or other fiber optic cables to sense movement. That's all expensive stuff. And like Emily was explaining, the way these districts maintain these levees is worse first. And we got a lot of worse that are going to come in first before any of that does. And similar to the habitat stuff, you know, it sounds great. And obviously, if we've got habitat like here, we're going to try to preserve it as much as we can, except to get it approved and use a risk-based analysis, that's going to require engineering review that takes a while, and we don't have money for that either. So if somebody could come through and with a magic wand, maybe do a lot of stuff around these islands to establish maybe a regional general permit that we can tap into. Okay, our levee fits what this RGP says. We'll go ahead and do our habitat work or whatever. That'd be nice. It's very difficult to get a regional general permit through the Corps. We've tried doing it with other things, and it just gets so bogged down in the biological opinions because the agencies don't really know, you guys don't really know what's going to happen. So everybody has comments that never resolve. But if we could get somebody to come in, help us out with that, and maybe help us out with some funding to set up some of these other instruments or whatever would help, that'd be fantastic.
Thanks for that. Building off of something that came up earlier, once upon a time, I worked on the legislation that gave birth to the 200-year urban levee standard. Glenn, I don't know if you're the right person on this panel to say, what's the status of compliance with that 200-year level of protection for urban levees in the Delta?
Yeah, so absolutely. So that is the areas within our jurisdiction that are affected by the 200-year. Or let me put it this way, the voters who have self-assessed to acquire that level of protection are mainly in the Lathrop-Manteca area. So we are in a feasibility study with the U.S. Army Corps to determine the necessary levee improvements that are required to get that area up to par. However, there are other challenging issues that are necessary. We can't just go ahead and build the levee high enough to achieve that. We also have to be mindful of the effects, the environmental effects, and the restoration opportunities, and leverage all of that to achieve those level of protection. Then the ULDC also requires us to consider climate change. And so we have come up with a policy that allows us to incorporate climate change. The state's projection is that the San Joaquin River will be as high as 3 times the flow that we see today. So now we have the core assessment that we're navigating through that doesn't really align so much with that, but does have a greater level of sea level rise. So we have these different guidances and these policies that we have to juggle and ultimately come up with what SAJAFCA wants to call a 200-year level of protection. So those are some of the challenges, but right now with our feasibility study phase, we have also partnered with DWR and executed an agreement that will allow us to proceed with early implementation of the project.
Great, thank you for that. And if I could remind everyone to speak in their microphones more closely too, so that we can have a great recording of this panel. Tom, I'm wondering if you can talk about how much new knowledge do we have on seismic risk since the DREAM study was prepared, almost 2 decades ago?
Yeah. We have enough that it makes it look interesting, but it's not. When you actually do the seismic analysis to come up with that probabilistic ground motion, it's actually a pretty complex assemblage of stuff. You put weights on different answers because you might study the fault, come to one conclusion, but there's a lot of uncertainty in it. Somebody else has another impression of the fault. And so you weigh those things, and that's usually worked out in the group of experts. So the bottom line is, my impression is there's enough new information. For example, new stuff we know about the Midland fault, which is the fault probably of greatest concern, and our ability to predict ground motion has improved a lot in those years. So I think the bottom line is we're probably at a point where it would be worthwhile to assemble a panel to assess whether or not the hazard is actually changed.
Okay. Gil.
So if I can add a little bit to that, back in 2016, the Independent Science Board of the Stewardship Council actually convened a seminar on the latest, greatest information that was based on the Napa earthquake of 2014. And it showed that the sensors in the Delta, there are motion sensors in the Delta, the way they reacted, estimated that Dreams overestimated the shaking by 4 times. That it actually dampened as the earthquake went on and didn't amplify. And then since that time, maybe Randall can explain what their experts have done, because he mentioned a new levee standard, and that's based on kind of newer information on seismic and then reaction of levees to seismic shaking.
Yeah, can I add one word to that?
Sure, and then Randall wants to weigh in too.
Yeah, the problem with the ground motion assessment is you can come to different answers, and certainly the Napa earthquake looked like the Delta behaved in a different way, but the motions are very weak motions. So the question come up, can you extrapolate to stronger shaking? And that's what you'd have to work through in terms of seeing whether or not things have changed.
So it seems like we know more about what we don't know.
Yeah. Well, we know which questions to ask.
So that's important. Emily, I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask this, but if not, feel free to pick someone else on the panel. But whatever happened to dredging? Are we still thinking that's going to yield flood protection benefits in the Delta? Is that still a feasible strategy in the Delta?
I know everyone talks about dredging all the time. It comes up, I think, at every public meeting that I attend. Is why aren't we dredging? We're losing carrying capacity in our channels, and it's all because of fish. It's really hard to get around that. So while you could gain a lot with carrying capacity in a lot of channels that have silted in, I'm not sure how we can do that moving forward in the Delta because of the mercury and all those metals that are in there from all the gold mining that happened that changed everything for us. So Gilbert may weigh in a little bit more on maybe some promise that he could have, but I don't know.
Well, for a few years, there was a committee set up called the Long-Term Management System, I think. It was authorized by the Corps of Engineers, San Francisco Division District, and they actually did a lot of work on how can we best use dredge material. And we got to the point where it had to go through a CEQA NEPA process, and we had no one to support the CEQA NEPA. So we kind of came short of identifying what it would take to reestablish dredging in the Delta. But certainly, the Port of Stockton does a lot of it. And so every year they have a maintenance dredging. So you can do some things, whether it's worthwhile for a reclamation district to do it, who knows, because the testing and monitoring can get quite expensive.
I want to add something. The dredging has been brought up in the Paradise Cut bypass expansion project. I've seen the effects of sedimentation along that channel firsthand. And the sedimentation buildup we're talking about is extensive. It prevents the possibility of that bypass, and it really has significant economic impacts to the community that are interested. That are interested in talk about dredging. So I think when we talk about those kind of issues, there might be a common solution that is, looking at some way of channel restoration, but also a possibility of ecosystem restoration, because the sedimentation could be moved around from the area where it's creating a problem to an area where it could be needed to restore habitat. So those are some of the unique situations and alternatives we're looking at on the Paradise Cut project.
Brian or Angela, did you want to weigh in there?
I was just going to add that a lot of times when maintenance dredging occurs, it's mainly sand that comes up, which doesn't have a lot of good characteristics for levee building material, maybe some stabilization, but the department did enter into what you were talking about, the LTMS, where we hired Steve Michelson, I think was his name, to take a look at how dredge spoils impact water quality. And we came to the conclusion that there wasn't a lot. And the regional board, both San Francisco and Central Valley regional board, adopted that outlook. So it's a lot easier now to do some dredge spoil, get that on island, but how you use it is typically, it's not real conducive for levee stability projects.
Angela.
Well, and I also want to add, it's not necessarily good soil for plantings either. So it's not very stable to put on the levee, but you usually have to top it off with some good soil if you actually want to plant on it as well. In addition to that, it's also very hard to find locations to put the dredge spoils. It's very expensive to actually do the work, but it's also very expensive to transport all that heavy sediment, right? And then where do you put it? Where there's not already resources present.
Randall, can you talk about the impact to water exports if a levee along the freshwater pathway were to fail? What happens in that scenario?
Yeah, one of the things I think people don't realize is even if the Department of Water Resources moves forward with their proposed Delta Conveyance project, that's 80% of the urban or supply for the state and federal projects would go through the Delta. So the Delta is extremely important for not only water supply for Bay Area, Central Valley, Southern California, but also for the economy of the state as a whole. And I can just leave it at that.
Can you address some of the preparation that Met and DWR and other agencies have undertaken in the event of some sort of emergency to that regard?
Yeah, one of the things that I kind of mentioned, we've been over the last almost 2 decades working kind of underneath the table, working within Delta Interest and these experts to come up with these types of solutions, a new levee design, different monitoring techniques out there so that we can secure the Delta. And we've tried to do it in a cost-effective approach. More recently in 2017, Metropolitan purchased some islands in the Delta. Since that time, we've already improved over with the help of DWR. And the funding from them, we've been able to improve over 15 miles of levee. We've also got a grant from the Delta Conservancy to take one of our islands. And thank you, Supervisor Burgess as well, to reduce subsidence and to help on the habitat of that. At the same time, making enough money to pay for itself too. So that is one of the islands in the central part of the Delta Web Tract. So we're working through that right now. So we're trying to do kind of a holistic approach, one that still is able to maintain farming on these islands, but do habitat as well as improvement for water supply security.
Yeah, as we're coming into flood season, like all of the different individuals know up here, the Flood Operations Center with the Department of Water Resources has a lot of facilities and assets deployed throughout the Delta, including large rock and different types of flood fighting methods, which just last Monday were tested at, with Victoria Island. So there is a lot of expertise at the Department of Water Resources with the Flood Operations Center and with the reclamation districts to utilize in the event of an emergency like we had last week.
I just want to make sure that the committee members understand what the freshwater pathway is. So right now, water gets to the South Delta, eventually to the pumps through the cross channel at Walnut Grove, Georgiana Slough, and 3 Mile Slough. So the Sacramento River water goes through the central delta and then gets pumped south. All those levees along those paths are important because if you get a levee breach and you start getting water sloshing in and out, it could impact water quality. And I don't know, I know earlier it was mentioned that in 1972, the Brandon Andrus levee broke. That was in June. It was actually George Basie's birthday. If you remember, like I said, I mentioned on the levee, George Basie was a 50-year attorney here in Sacramento. Anyways, on his birthday, he actually formed with the legislature Brandon Andrus Levee Maintenance District in 1969. So 3 years later, the levee broke on his birthday. Anyway, it took 300,000 acre-feet of water to push that salt water back, keep it at bay. And that's what could happen with some of these big, deeper islands flood. That it's a force that it's just very almost impossible to fight. But luckily, there was water in the reservoirs to dump that water. If it happens at the third, fourth year of a drought, who knows? But that's the risk we take.
I think I want to pause there and turn it to Chair Lee and see if we have questions from the DPIIC members.
Sure. So members, does anyone have any questions for any of our panelists? Yes, Campbell.
I wanted to ask, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to ask Lorena.
President.
Hello?
Yes.
Okay. Lorena, I was curious, you mentioned that the guidance for veg on levees is going into a policy discussion in the near term. Can you crystal ball that? I mean, do you expect that to be a process that maybe largely adopts it as is, or could it change substantially? And if so, do you have any idea in which ways?
So I can't speculate so much on how it's going to change, but I can give you a rough timeline. So currently we're in the process of drafting initial documentation right now. We're then going to go into a substantial internal review process that will last through about, I'll say June of next year. And then beyond that, then we're going to be starting to look for a lot of agency feedback and interested party and stakeholder feedback on that draft proposed guidance. And that, period is going to be before the public review period. Now, per the Water Resources Reform and Development Act of 2014, which is what's driving this, Section 3013, that's part of our process, is this kind of gathering the views of stakeholders, gathering the views of other resource agencies, states, and levee maintainers. So that's going to be the process that's kicking off in, we're going to call it late summer, early fall of this year. And then after that, then we have to go through the public review process. So there's a lot of opportunities for that, what's being proposed to change. Now, what we've put forward in the best management practices is based off of what the science has told us so far. So we took a conservative approach. Now, there's been a lot of really fantastic science done in the last 10 years around this topic, so we feel very confident about the science portion of it. But really what it's going to come down to is implementation. So how is this going to be palatable? And, the challenge is, across the US, we don't want to create something that's so restrictive that it works great in California, but maybe it doesn't work so good in Mississippi. So that's going to be the real balancing act that we take on.
Anyone else? Yes, Jake.
We've talked a lot about the physical, biological, and infrastructure aspects of the levees today, but we haven't talked very much about the sociocultural aspects of the levees proper, and especially public access. I know that might be part of another conversation. I don't want to go very deep here, but as I drive around, it seems like there's a bit of a juxtaposition between sort of accessibility, ownership, responsibility, et cetera. And I wonder if anybody wanted to kind of comment on that a little bit, and perhaps again, maybe painting a picture of a successful case where public access has been part of the conversation on either a levee or a levee restoration project or something like that. Just interested in how do you speak to the public and engage the public in conversations about levees beyond just simply they're important, who are they important for, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say, not all levees are equal, right? And there are very good opportunities to invite the public in and have part of the system. And I'm thinking Dutch Slough right off the top of my head. I'm thinking McCormick-Williamson, Consumnes River area, where there's a lot of public lands that are being converted into habitat, and it's very conducive for public access and recreation and things of that nature. Also, I'm thinking Sherman Island, where there's a big kite surfing area in a county park. But there are a lot of instances where it's not the best of ideas on private property, where the levee is very sensitive, and disturbance of a very steep rock regime is not only dangerous but could adversely impact the levee as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there under certain circumstances, but there's a lot of instances where it just doesn't fully mesh. And I'm 100% behind, as a sailor, as a kayaker, as I used to windsurf back when it was windsurfing. There's a lot of opportunities out there. And we need to think about that with each and every project, but it probably isn't going to be a one size fits all. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I'd agree with you that it's hard to get public access in the Delta, and it's too bad because it's a beautiful place, and I want Californians to know that this place exists because it's got so many opportunities. But there's that side of levee management that you can't really let a lot of public get on the levees for reasons of they might move around your project, your rocks to fish, which happens a lot. A lot of trash gets left on the levees. Actually, that's one of the gripes by one of the managers of the districts I work for, is that he's constantly moving trash off the levees. Had to get an entire new piece of equipment to do that, which is too bad. That there's kind of a lack of respect there, and so it closes off even more to the public when you don't, when people aren't respecting the levee the way that it should be, or the environment. But yeah, open to ideas about how to get more public access in the Delta so that everyone can enjoy it, because it is special.
One other thought, this comes up quite a bit. We haven't seen it in the last few years, but every few years the legislature will come up with a bill that says, hey, you got to allow public access because you're taking public money. The biggest argument from farmers is that it's dangerous. You're out here in a farming community. Luckily, we have a county road here that at least you can drive safely, well, somewhat safely. It's a pretty narrow county road. But other roads on levees, that's what all the farm equipment travels on. So you're fighting with the harvester coming down, and they're not looking for you because they're out farming, and it gets pretty dangerous. And I remember years ago, I had a Jeep Cherokee. It was the one car I had that wasn't a Toyota, and it didn't have independent front suspension. And I hit these washboard, and I almost went off the levee because the car just started floating all over the place. And then another story, by the way, I've got millions of stories. I was one of the first levees I surveyed was Rec District 348 New Hope Tract. And I'm on the north side by the McKelvey River Bridge, and we ran into this bamboo. And so I had my survey guys hacking through the bamboo with machetes so we could survey through. And suddenly I look up and I see a puppy. So I start petting the puppy, and then I look up and I see a gun pointed at me. And it's the farmer that lived there with an M1 carbine. And he says, what are you doing on my levee? And he started explaining to me that kayakers, whoever come up on the shore, climb over and pull over an air compressor or something out of his yard. And he's losing thousands of dollars of equipment. So it's a tough nut to crack to figure out how do you set up public access without really impacting the locals and causing maybe some harm to the public because of safety issues.
Jay, did you have a comment on this as well?
This has been a great panel discussion, and I think really highlights the complexity of different values that we're managing to achieve across the Delta. And I guess on my optimistic days, I see science out there that is more accessible across hydrology, biology, climate effects, you name it. On the other hand, I worry that we have to get to a programmatic approach to address priorities for mitigation, as Brian knows, areas where we could prioritize public access, areas where we're going to manage to enhance the health of the ecosystem through very specific experiments like cash slew. And I just feel like we need to get to a programmatic approach or we're never going to make progress here. And I would just ask the panel to give us suggestions on where to start on that, because I feel like we're condemned to fail if we kind of do each project as an individual one-off rather than, hey, we have a strategy to manage the different values across the Delta in recognizing the complexity of this place, but where the opportunities are at the same time.
Well, I'm only going to speak to the habitat component because that's my job. We're currently pursuing a regional conservation investment strategy to really look at the resources that are out in the Delta, but it helps us in two different ways. One, in really looking over the Delta as a whole, how can we plan for all of the biological resources that are out there? And then to not only get grant funds and sort of help us get grant funds, but also to help us on the mitigation side of things, because that's really going to help us identify, okay, where are areas that we need to do some conservation and some habitat restoration, and then use that for mitigation as we make levee improvements. So that's definitely one effort that we're pursuing currently. To move that forward. So any support in that would be wonderful. But we're currently looking to CDFW to help fund that through a grant.
I'll just share a quick comment. If I may. So when San Joaquin Area Flood Control Agency did the feasibility study for phase 1, which is protecting the Stockton metro area, the plan was to purchase all the mitigation as compensatory mitigation at that time. So by the time we got to actually building the project, there's hardly any mitigation left. And so there was regional demand and competition. So the flood space competes with other industries on priorities when it comes to mitigation and ecosystem restoration. So there is a need for regional approach, and I think the regional conservation investment strategy is going to help. The Central Valley Flood Protection Board has a system-wide integrated strategy, of which some of our projects are a part of. So I feel that the recognition that the flood space and the ecosystem and recreation and other need to coexist and somehow come up with a regional plan that avoids us from being in the same situation as we're in right now with phase 1, where we don't really have the mitigation and have to go out and start strategizing to meet that need.
So since you're moving on, you can lead this effort for it.
So Tom, did you have one comment? And then I want to go to Diane Burgess.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Jay's comment. I think climate is an issue that even though we think about it, we worry about it, we don't worry about it enough, because climate change is going to go on for centuries. We don't know exactly the details of it. So what we plan for the next 50, 100 years, when we get to the end of that, we're probably going to be dealing with the same problem for the next 100 years. So taking a longer term view, I think, would really be an important first step.
As I approach the ending of my term as chair of the Delta Protection Commission and serving on the Delta Stewardship Council, I've got to say I'm really very pleased that we did this meeting today. So I just want to thank the chair and Jessica and staff. Erin, thank you. As Jessica said, levees are the backbone of the Delta. And we heard that 80% of the state water supply goes through this Delta. Farmers, recreation, the cultural value property, the safety of people. It's all dependent on levees. And we've heard that there's a really big concern about the subvention program not being funded and how it's been an unreliable, undependable, source to know. And I think it's also important to remember how precious and fragile the Delta is, and that we've now have the National Heritage Area to celebrate that. One of the things that we've heard over and over is funding, and there's not enough of it. And as an elected leader, I very rarely hear anybody say we have more than enough. And in a state where now we're seeing a deficit, it's unfortunate that we weren't able to strengthen that program when we did have money. One of the things as an elected leader that I've observed is that folks often, not on purpose, but often work in silos. You each have your own mission, your own projects, your own philosophy on how to do things. And it doesn't necessarily consider the multiple values of something, including for you, what levees would be providing. And you're right, Tom, climate change, sea level rise, the threat of saltwater intrusion, all those things are an issue that we still need to consider. 2/3 are non-project levees, meaning that there's dominoes that can fail and impact others. And so I'm just very encouraged that we as DPIIC came together to talk about it. There's federal, state, county, city, reclamation, district, and landowners that all need to have to be on the same page. And as an elected leader, I think there's a lot of elected leaders that don't even understand this. So I encourage you as different department representatives to help our legislative staff and leaders understand. And those that are in the audience that are representing those elected leaders, I really appreciate you spending your time learning, because this was an opportunity. We really need more money for subvention. We need more money for mitigation. And I hope you'll take that message back with you and find a way to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions for our panelists from our members? Nope. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jessica.
Okay. I want to thank all of our speakers and to the DPIIC members for your attention and engagement, as well as our audience members who took time out of their day to be here and learn about this important topic. I'm really glad to hear that there is continued innovation in levee management, the way we're thinking about levees. There's a lot of smart people who care about these issues, and that's really more than half the battle. It's clear that sustainable funding is a huge challenge. We just talked about subventions. There's no easy answers, but it looks like we really need to think about creative and new approaches to solve that problem. I'm hearing there's an opportunity to advance the science around seismic risk and associated levee fragility in the Delta. I think the council looks forward to collaborating with the Army Corps on these risk assessment implementation guidelines. It's our role as the council to convene people to move these conversations forward and to generate ongoing interest, to raise awareness, and to really try to do what we can to affect positive change in implementing the Delta plan. So thank you.
So well said. Thanks, Jessica. And thanks to all the panel members for coming here today. We really appreciate your time and the information that you shared. So thank you again very much. Do we have any public comment on this agenda item? No, Eric? Okay, thank you very much. We are doing great on time, by the way. I think what we have next is looking forward to any upcoming meetings. So I want to give the DPIC members a chance to share any closing comments about today or propose any topics for upcoming meetings, if anyone has any ideas, thoughts. Yes, Josephine.
Yes, hello there. I was just going to comment briefly regarding Lorena's great overview there of what's coming soon. So I think that's naturally an excellent topic as a follow-up to today. I'm sure we could figure out additional presentation and direct involvement with this group on what those details look like. I was trying to look on my phone earlier, the dredge material management conversation earlier. I know there's a regional DMMP, dredge material management plan, that's going out for public review, I think in early 2025. Oh, good, you're nodding your head, or you're just nodding your head. Okay, sorry. I think it's Bay Delta, or is it just Bay? I'm not 100% sure, but I just wanted to make mention of that. The Corps is definitely interested in beneficial use of dredge material. We have a nationwide goal for that, and we do a bit of dredging, and we try to find good spots for it. I'm hoping at some point in the not too distant future, the Delta Islands and Levees is what we call it, which would be the first time, I think, in a while that it'd be a few hundred acres of wetland restoration in the Delta that we've been waiting on authorization and appropriations, but I think we're getting there. So I'm hopeful that'll be a topic for the future. And then I just wanted to end with, we call it engineering with nature now, but just listening to a lot of today's conversation, you know, that I was talking to somebody during our lunch break there, this YOLO bypass comprehensive plan that the Corps is working on with non-federal sponsors. You know, we, the country, we're doing engineering with nature over 100 years ago, but we're now a proving ground for really that mentality of working with nature and looking at multi-benefits. So I had to put that plug in too. Thank you.
Thanks, Josephine. Does anyone else have any other thoughts or comments about today or our upcoming meetings? No? Okay.
I just want to say briefly, I think one of the panelists touched on this, but the importance of integrating a strategic focused dredging program to improve circulation in the Delta as well. I think that all the modeling that USGS, DWR, other parties are doing shows that, you know, we're really, I think, Glenn, you touched on this, that these climate effects of these huge winters followed by extensive drought are affecting levee stabilization and changing the patterns of deposition in the Delta as well. And so I think that we, you know, just should be mindful of the need to integrate, I think, those thoughts that Jessica was teasing out also in her questioning. And then I think also for a future meeting, thinking about how we align a programmatic approach to do all things in a little more integrated way than we tend to do, which puts a lot of pressure on individual agencies on the mitigation side of things. If we knew we were going for mitigation, we could reduce the cost and accelerate timetable to permitting. I think we need to give some attention to that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, Campbell.
Just a quick note, we do have a new invasive species in the Delta, the golden mussel. And so we might want to take some time to get an update on that and talk a little bit more about early detection, rapid response responsibilities and our resources in the future.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, was there any other thoughts, anyone else? Yes.
Turn it on this time. I really just wanted to say thank you to all the speakers today and to the convening of this committee. I was just kind of reflecting, I've been in a lot of levee related conversations over the years, and it was great to see some familiar faces today that I haven't seen in a while. But one of the things that just really strikes me, looking at the panel sitting before me and the speakers from earlier, is just in its own way, this is such an integrated topic. There are others, but one that just really strikes me, it just really draws from academia. You know, we have the landowners, the local reclamation district, state, federal. So this is kind of an area that I think naturally lends itself maybe to kind of exploring programmatic. That idea, I think that is probably a really good way to go and to think about, especially, I know we've talked a lot about funding, and I wish I had things to say about funding. I know I got to tiptoe around it a little bit, but completely get that, we are all looking at some times where we're going to be pretty constrained, at least for a little while. But I think I have a lot of hope. I was saying to someone that, I try to stay optimistic after all this time, that I think this is a very innovative bunch. I think, we kind of come at this just wanting to do good and wanting to move things ahead. So yeah, I just wanted to echo things that others have said and just really say thank you to all the folks that were here today and the folks in the audience for spending the time. This is really important, and I think it's one of those areas we could move things coming together. So thank you.
Yeah, that is wonderful to hear. Thank you so much for that comment. All right, I'll look around with the panelists one more time, and we'll go to public comment. Are there any public comments on this agenda item? All right, seeing none. I think that our last item is for any public comments for items not on the agenda. So if there's anything that we didn't cover on the agenda that someone would like to bring up now, speak now or forever. Till the next meeting, exactly. All right, Eric, are you seeing anything? Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone for their time and attention today. DPIIC dates for 2025 will be coming up. Amanda will be in touch with you all. I encourage you to stay here and relax for a little bit and visit. And thank you all for bearing with us. Outside meetings are not always easy, and I think the staff here did a great job, both here at Bogle and our council staff. There's a lot of logistics when you're outside, a lot of unknowns, a lot of unplanned fires, things like that. So thanks for rolling with us today. Fortunately, the weather cooperated and it was gorgeous, and we really appreciate everyone coming. So thank you very much. Thank you. Well done. Thank you.